Good afternoon. I'm Mark Allen with Gabriel.io, and I'm here today with Julian Colina, the CTO and founder of Haystack. Good afternoon, Julian. How you doing?
Good afternoon. I am doing great. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I like your background. It looks like New York. Is that what it is?
I am in New York. This is a virtual background, but I guess it's pretty representative of where I'm at today.
Yeah, and I hear it's pretty hot up there this time of year. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, it's nice, but I prefer it as opposed to the cold.
Yes, I know. But I've been in both. So to start with, can you share a brief background of yourself and your work history?
Yeah, sure. So, right now I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Haystack. We're building an analytics tool for engineering leaders that plugs into GitHub to help showcase how teams are performing, as well as proactively alert to issues like feature delays, burnout, and some things that might be impacting software teams today. In terms of background, I come from an engineering background. I've probably worked on everything from an individual contributor engineer to a manager, director, CTO, and now sitting in that CEO role.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of built skilled remote teams, everything from the ground up engineers all the way to leading the whole squad.
So your new product, Haystack, you touched on it. Is it really a tool for engineering managers, or is it for engineering teams or individual developers, or all?
So everybody gets a look on Haystack in one way, shape, or form. So the reporting side is really for those engineering managers and for the engineering leadership, so executives. But for engineers themselves, you get really, really helpful alerting systems for, when your code is ready to review, when somebody's requesting your review, if something's growing stale. So a whole bunch of ways to sort of alert when you're needed or when you could better support a teammate. You get that helpful notification right in email or Slack.
And generally today that is done via email, but manually, right? So it sounds like you've automated that process. True?
Yeah, exactly. So there's less chasing people around, less shoulder tapping, trying to get your code reviews done. And a lot of this podcast is going to be about remote. So in this remote world, it's even harder to tap somebody's shoulder and get that code review approved and through the pipeline.
Yeah, and you talked about burnout, which is interesting. How do you measure burnout? That's kind of hard to quantify.
It is definitely hard to quantify, and we actually did a study on this showing some pretty amazing results when it comes to how many developers actually do suffer from burnout. So this has been top of mind for us, and the way that we really approach it is by trying to identify patterns that tend to showcase burnout. So especially in this remote world where you're not face to face all the time,
Mm-hmm.
it can be really difficult to actually identify when somebody might be struggling with, let's say, too much work. Or even having those symptoms of burnout. So what we're doing is we're really looking for those patterns that we've identified sort of across the customer base that can equate to somebody burning out. In this case, it'd be higher workloads, it'd be odd off hours, weekend work on a consistent basis, or maybe spikes and anomalies in those particular data patterns. And what we'll do is we'll alert that manager, even that engineer themselves, and say, hey, maybe this is a topic for conversation. That way we can keep a more sustainable workload over time.
Interesting. So, and it's funny because I've developed in my life, and I always had, when I start working a lot, and if I make a rookie mistake when I'm coding, I'm like, okay, that's it. It's time to shut the computer off and take a break. You might change, look for that, rookie mistakes.
And it's hard to catch yourself too, because I think a lot of developers, a lot of engineers are probably like me, where you sit down and it's really hard to leave a problem when you're in it. And I think a lot of those cases, sometimes it's best to let it sit and relax a little bit, let it come to you.
It'll still, yeah. I've learned over the years that the problem will still be there in the morning. They don't go away.
No, they don't go away. They don't go away. That is very true.
And have you, now it's interesting because of remote work, one of the big topics here, I have to believe that burnout has increased because a lot of developers are like, well, I can't go out, so I might as well code, right?
100%. On our website, there's a great blog and great research on it. We actually just conducted this pretty well done piece of industry study, which showcased, the headline was actually 83% of developers have suffered from burnout, and a vast majority of them actually indicate that COVID and working from home sort of contributed to that? I think it's mostly due to this change in working environments, because working remote is truly different when it comes to this idea of work-life balance. Your home is your office, and really breaking those two things apart can be a challenge when you initially do it. I'm sure we'll get into some of those trade-offs a bit in this podcast, but pretty interesting stuff if anybody is interested in reading that study.
Well, yeah, I think it'd be great. So can you tell people the name of your website so they can go look for it?
Yeah, so use haystack.io. So Haystack's the name of the company. Use haystack.io is the website, and there should be a blog section right at the top. And if you search for that, it should be right up in there.
Now it's interesting. I'm assuming Haystack also has a development team. So I'm assuming you use your own product to monitor your developers.
Of course, we do. We definitely use it. We sort of bring it up in every retrospective to make sure we're not taking on too much work, spreading too thin. And if there's anything that we want to solve, let's say a feature was delayed, it gives us a really actionable point, really actionable feature or delivery that we can point to and say, okay, maybe we need to change process, have better specs, maybe create some automation. So we use it pretty heavily in our retrospectives as well.
Interesting. And you told me that you actually started the company during the pandemic, like right around when the pandemic was starting. So did that cause any challenges that you didn't expect? Because that, everything had to be remote. You didn't have a choice.
I've worked remote even before starting Haystack. I've helped work with remote teams as well as build some remote teams, and I've seen a ton of benefits from working remote. I think they outweigh the cons that people often talk about. So from day one, Haystack was a remote company. Even when my co-founder and I actually were roommates, funny enough, I would go work in the coffee shop and he would be coding at home, and we would still have our Google Meets up. So we treated ourselves like a remote company even on day one. And that sort of culture sort of expanded to the company as it is today. Even today, when we have sort of our team spread across all four corners of the world, you got UK, Singapore, US, all over the place.
Oh, wow. So you're a truly global company. So, and you did that in 14 months. You built a company with developers and workers in 4 different continents.
Yep. So, like I said, we sort of had the game plan to go remote, and I think it's paid off pretty well. We have a whole diverse set of talented members of the team all across the world, and it's working out pretty well so far.
Cool. And you talked about the trade-offs between remote work and the 9 to 5 in the office. What would you say they are in general? The big ones.
So I think there's a ton of benefits to working remote. I think there's some obvious ones: larger talent pool, more flexibility for work-life balance, space to do deep work, especially if you're an engineer. And when it comes to some of the cons, I think most people think it's harder to manage people. You don't see faces in the office. A lot of people say, how could we tell if people are working, and some of these types of things. I think brainstorming is often one that gets flagged as a potential issue when it's remote. But I think ultimately with the tools that we have today, it becomes not so big of an issue. So after working remote, even across all 4 corners of the world, a global team, we actually found that it produces a lot of best practices. It actually forces you to have some best practices in place. So with a team like ours, there's a lot of asynchronous work. There's a lot of areas where we need to be really great about documentation, about communication, and really focusing on outcomes over office hours, which I think all those things are just sort of really great for a company as a whole to have great documentation, great communication practices, and really focused on outcomes as opposed to how long did you work today.
Right.
So at the end of the day, I think a lot of these things get pointed to as maybe trade-offs for remote work, in my opinion, are actually huge strengths of a well-run remote team.
No, I would agree with that. I've noticed that the teams that are 100% remote, they have to be more disciplined, because if they're not, they're right. So I agree with you 100% on that. And that's true from what I've seen. The only one I think that was hard that you mentioned is the brainstorming. That's the hardest one, right?
The brainstorming is the hardest one. There's tools out there. You got Miro as your virtual whiteboard. I've got my iPad here right next to you where I can draw up on it. I think the tools are coming our way. There's probably a little bit of room for improvement, but so far, to be completely honest, it hasn't been too big of an issue. Even Zoom calls like these and tools like Miro have gotten us pretty far with brainstorming even.
Yeah, and I've used Miro too. It is a good tool. It's just, you're right. It's just, just a little bit more, right? It's hard to describe what's missing, but it's not quite 100% yet.
Right.
And I think tools like yours also help with the remote workers, right? I mean, because it's something that a manager in New York, say, can know what a team in, the Middle East is doing, or anywhere in the world, right?
Yeah, one of the main reasons that teams, especially newly remote teams, have been coming to us more recently is to really understand this exact question that we're talking about. What are the trade-offs for my engineering team when it comes to being in office versus remote? And we're still working to finalize a lot of this research, but this is largely what we help teams do in this day and age. As we start to think about, do we go back to the office? Do we continue to stay remote? Are we going to do a hybrid? Well, it really helps to understand what your delivery process looked like when you were in the office, and what does it look like now? And what are those patterns and those trends ultimately end up looking like when you're introducing some of these other factors like remote work? So Haystack has helped give visibility to most of our client base in terms of which decision they can make and how that's really going to impact our overall performance. And I think it has been a net positive overall based on the companies that we're working with today, the flexibility of remote.
Yeah, in general, I've seen that too, that companies say that. And companies that were totally against remote 2-3 years ago have said, if I'd known what I know now, I would have done this 5 years ago.
And everybody over the course of the past year has been more or less forced into it. And
Right.
I think we've all proven it can be done.
Yes, yes, it can. And what I think is going to be interesting, and you tell me if you agree with this, is, a lot of companies, it forced them to get more disciplined. And now companies are just starting to go back to the way it used to be. And it'll be interesting to see if they lose that discipline when they go back to the office.
This is actually one of the things that I always warn teams who are thinking about going remote, which is that half team, where half of your team might be remote, the other half is in the office. It creates sort of an imbalance where you're not all using the same tools anymore. There's
Right.
water cooler conversations that are no longer out in sort of public or written down or documented. So you're still building these data silos, these knowledge silos, even for something as simple as a hybrid remote culture. And I think it's something to keep in mind as people start going back to the office and start thinking about how they're gonna return back to normal, because that is one of the hardest parts about being remote. If let's say I have to call in via Zoom, but the rest of the team sort of having chats behind the camera, then I lose a lot of that information, and I think it makes communication a lot more difficult.
Yes, it does. And just out of curiosity, since you are a new company, you had to go remote. It sounds like you were going to anyway. But now that things are starting to get a little bit back to normal, do you foresee that you'll have an office, or are you going to stay 100% remote?
We will likely stay 100% remote. The team is already global, and as we scale, we don't really see any issues with that. It's been all net positive when it comes to working remotely.
Cool. And then from your standpoint, it's kind of cool because you can just work from anywhere in the world, wherever you want to go that you happen to want to go that week, correct?
That's true. It gives you a lot of flexibility to work from wherever has Wi-Fi, at least. And so, I can eventually, when things start opening back up, hopefully we can do more customer calls. I can go meet you over in the Bay Area, and we can grab a coffee. So yeah, it gives a lot of flexibility that way.
Or if this beautiful island behind me had Wi-Fi, we could meet there. What do you think?
That sounds great. Gonna have to test the internet over there on the beach.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I'll go a week ahead of time and do that for you. How's that?
That sounds perfect. Sounds perfect.
Well, Julian, it was great talking today. It sounds like Haystack, it sounds like you guys are going to be busy. I think you've got a good little product there. And I shouldn't say little, you got a good product there. Being a dev manager myself in the past, it is something that will help, especially with remote teams. I think that's a huge advantage to a lot of these companies that are going to go remote now that they've had a taste of it. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. I think getting more visibility into how teams are performing is even more important when everybody's not sort of in the office together.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, I mean, I know we said, do you plan to venture out into other things besides development? Because it could be applicable to other areas of a business.
I think that's probably a long road from where we're at today. There's a lot of ways that we can help engineering teams, and we'll probably stick our focus to that, at least for the foreseeable future.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for your time, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, you too. Thanks for having me.
All right.